The final landscapes I want to look at are those of Mesoamerica. And the reason for that, very simply, is that they're so totally different, conceptually, cognitively, symbolically, that I think they're really important to at least get a sort of a basic exposure to, simply because they help to remind us that different groups of people see the world in very, very, very different ways. This is very true in the Pacific, but again, Pacific is not a particularly large area in terms of population, in terms of sort of impact in world history. It's not really a big deal. It's sad to say. But Mesoamerica was the Aztec empires, the Inca empires, and to a lesser extent Mayan and even earlier Toltec. When you get into southern parts of North America, you're dealing with populations that, especially in Mesoamerica, were huge by European standards, and organized, political entities like the Aztec were substantially larger than probably almost all of Europe put together. So you had these enormous political, religious, social empires that were based on an entirely different perception of reality, an entirely different perception of people in the world around them than Europeans, or especially in this case, the Spanish, were familiar with. And this has led to I think, massive sort of misunderstanding, one, of what Mesoamerican societies were like, but two, I think sort of by disregarding that, sort of thinking them as being exotic, it tends to belittle the fact that, people are very complex, and the way we see the world is very complex. And especially since so much of the world is based on interpretation and perception, that if you have a different perception of the world around you, it's going to change just about how you interact with every aspect of that world. So let's take a very quick, short and dirty look at largely what might call be Azteca, Tolteca, geomancy and design and symbolism. First off, and this is really, really key, because this is also true in a lot of the Pacific, especially in the Western Pacific, symbols and aspects of the world around you that we would think of as being perceptual, in Mesoamerica were actually seen as reality. So it was very typical for people to, literally walk down a street and suddenly interact with some sort of a spirit, much more so than would be in a very, not so much casual way, but in a much more structured way, unlike what you'd see in places like Japan still today. So what you had was people's manipulation of the world around them, their built environment, was based on a perception that they were dealing with a reality, not that they were dealing with a potential or a symbolic or a sort of other place, other time type thing. And the basic premise of all this, which was found throughout almost all of Mesoamerica, and in fact, even into South America, and you see these aspects of this even still today, was that at a very, very basic level, the universe that folks in this part of the world lived in was based on a premise that the gods were very powerful. So again, like their Greek counterparts, other counterparts, or Chinese counterparts, they had personalities, they had attitudes and stuff like that, but they had made the world around them. And one of the things they liked is they liked food, and they made people as food. So people were put on the planet as food for gods, and that was their sole function. In fact, one of the classic Mayan stories basically calls people rabbits, in the sense that the gods hunted people like you'd hunt rabbits as food, and because they enjoyed catching people, there was sport in it, in the same way that people hunt rabbits, because it takes some skill. And so the function of people wasn't to dominate the planet. The function of people wasn't to be in the image of God. The function of people was to be entertainment and food for gods. And that was the basic premise that underlies almost all aspects of Mesoamerican religions, and not surprisingly, the perception of the world around them. If you perceive yourself, and the world you see yourself in is actually a world in which you're prey, so you're the equivalent of a rabbit or a chicken or something like that, you're going to be very careful how you move around, how you expose yourself, on what you do. Last thing you want to do is attract attention, because the gods are always hungry and the gods are always ready to play, and play meant hunting and consuming people. So you live in a world, I suppose in a Western sense, maybe the word would be paranoia, in which you have to be constantly aware and cautious of the potential impact of everything you do, especially in built environment and just how you move on the landscape, because it could attract attention of the gods. There's no such thing as a good god. All the gods are hungry. All the gods eat people. And so what you find is this is the basic premise. Now it's most spectacularly seen in the Aztecas. We'll see in a minute, but this goes way back. This is actually in the Mayan uh, and Olmec stories that are basically underlying creation myths of the Mayan and Olmec, who are your sort of founding groups. The huge, as we'll see, the huge urban center of Teotihuacan is based on this premise. So every aspect of urban planning, urban design, even house design, was based on this idea that people had to be careful because their main purpose or existence was to feed gods. And you know this obviously going to shape everything in the world around you. One of the other aspects of this is that, not surprisingly, then dark places, especially things like caves and such, become places to hide and become positive places. Where I think in the Western sense, caves are scary and creepy and da 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 da. In the Mesoamerican sense, caves are actually where people were born from. So people came out of caves. That was basically the womb where the gods had people, I suppose, hatched, for lack of a better term, and they came out of the caves. And if you were being chased or something like that, your first inclination would be to go back into a cave because then you'd be safe. Most of the gods apparently didn't like the dark and didn't like caves, so that was your safety zone. It was your refuge. And so what happens then is you have this idea, especially when you look at houses. Let's very quickly take a look at one here. Here we see an example. We're a little further north. This is southern Arizona. This is a pueblo. But this is the same system. The Pueblans had the same perceptual system, was part of this Mesoamerican system. And so what you get here is an interesting structure. A pueblo is basically a community. Its closest parallel would be like an apartment block, I guess, in the Western sense. So it's a whole series of homes here stacked together. They're all interrelated. Many of them have passages from one area to the next. And notice how that there's very little in the way of windows. There's very little in the way of door access. This is intentional. Partially, it's just a function of the environment. It's very hot. These are adobe walls. They're quite thick, and so they're very good at insulating against heat, but you don't want to let heat in through large open areas. So a lot of this is just, it's just environmentally logical. It's a good environmental design. But this also has to do with this premise of people hiding from predators. This very much is in the idea that when people are in these structures, they're hidden from the predators. If the predator can't see you, it's not interested in eating you. And so in the traditional sort of underlying logic of this type of construction was that you wanted a place that basically mimicked a cave. And if you had a cliff, then obviously the caves would be in the cliff. This is sort of a above ground way to build that particular environment. Well, this is entirely residential. There's some religious areas in here. I think there's two kivas. Looks like two kivas here from the ramps. But this is largely a residential area. But it's within this premise of people's only function is as prey. You can't kill the gods. You can't even hurt the gods. But the gods can and will eat you on a moment's notice if they see you and notice you. Okay, here we see Teotihuacan. This is the huge capital city in this part of the world. Somewhere between 750,000, maybe a half million and a half. Much larger than any of its contemporaries in Europe. In fact, except for a few cities in China, probably undoubtedly one of the top 10 largest cities in the world at the time. This dates from about 6 to 800 AD as its height of its success. That's when all this area here was built up. But the city goes all the way back here. The city went all the way into the foothills. There's a large lake. It goes all the way around the lake. So an area, it's probably about the size of Los Angeles, I would guess. It's been a while since I've been there. I'm trying to visualize it. But what you had were basically in this area, you had your ritual center here. I'll get into that in a second. And what you had was all the rest of this was residential compounds. Here's what one of the residential compound foundations looked like. Let's see if we can actually get that. And so what you had is very much like the pueblos we saw earlier. You had basically stacked structures and in clusters, almost no openings. What you find that's really interesting in Teotihuacan is the openings tend to be you have to bend over to get in. There's almost no windows. So again, one of the main functions of this structure was to protect people from predators. And of course, the predators were the gods. And one of the ways that you did that was actually the function of these particular ritual things called pyramids. It wasn't until the 1960s that they actually went back and looked, ironically, at the Spanish records of the Aztecs, and actually went and looked at the Aztec writing, what little was available in terms of Aztec ritual, and realized the importance of caves. They didn't detest, and they realized that this whole area here is riddled with lava tubes. The whole area here is volcanic. And there's two very large lava chambers, one directly under the center of this and one directly under the center. So the Pyramid of the Sun, Pyramid of the Moon, both are basically on large, huge structures built on massive, large lava tubes, lava chambers, which apparently were seen as the original birthplaces of people. People came from wombs that were caves, and apparently these were seen as the sort of primordial wombs. Now, these structures served another purpose, however. Gods, one of the analogies for gods in Mesoamerica was the eagle. And it's still, and that's one reason why it's such an important image in Mexico. So the eagle, is a predator. It flies in the air and it swoops down and grabs things. Eagles, hang around in trees, they hang around on cliffs. And so what you get is these pyramids were made to mimic this particular mountain back here. And the function of that was very simply, if you were going to mimic this mountain or that mountain or even the one back there, then you were providing a place which would be attractive for eagles to rest, or gods who were like eagles to rest. What you would do is you would then take food up here, put it on top of this pyramid for the purpose of feeding the gods. Not making the gods happy, just feeding them. If you fed the gods would be full. If the gods would be full, they wouldn't go hunting the people in the city. And so the function of the pyramids was sort of two. One, it was a protection for the womb that was where people came from. Secondly, it was a higher point of contact with gods. And so they would be the first place the gods would notice. And there was sort of an attitude, while gods were smart, gods were also sort of dumb. So if they got used to you feeding them in a particular place, they would come back and look for food there first because it was the easiest. And so what you get is the functions of pyramids in Mesoamerica had nothing to do with pyramids in Egypt. The function of pyramids in Mesoamerica was sort of like a McDonald's with free snacks or something like that if you were a god. So when the Aztecs come in from north, come in from what's now New Mexico, Arizona, come into this area of central Mexico and take it over, they too, now that's the Pueblo groups that they too have exactly the same perception of the relationship with the spiritual or whatever. And so they basically keep this same logic. So let's take a look at the last version of this, which is what the Spanish run into in the 1490s, 1500s. Okay. So here we see Tenochtitlan. This is the center of the city. Tenochtitlan was, again, a very large city. Extremely interesting engineering taking place, since a lot of Tenochtitlan was actually on the lake. So it's actually a cluster of islands which eventually became merged into one huge urban complex. Again, extremely large. I don't know if anyone's ever figured it out, but I would suspect the population in Tenochtitlan might have been almost the equivalent of a large chunk of the entire population of Spain. This is where the conquistadores, Cortez and the Spanish, come in and basically conquer this empire and start, basically conquering Mesoamerica. The Azteca were by far the largest political entity in this part of the world at the time, controlled everything, including what's now the southern United States, all the way down to pretty much almost Costa Rica, Panama. And it was centralized in Mexico, so what's now Mexico City, which actually is Tenochtitlan. The center, this urban complex here is now where the Congress building is, the presidential palace is there, the center of the judiciary is there. This is the central plaza in Mexico City, is this same location. That was done intentionally by the Spanish. So what you have here is a set again of these pyramids. The same logic takes place. In this particular interesting thing, there's no caves. You're on a lake. A cave's not going to work. So we're not really sure what the Aztec logic for putting the structures here was. There must have been some logic. We're just not sure what it was. But what you have is nonetheless the same idea of feeding gods. This horrified the Spanish when they arrived, because what the Aztec were much more, the Aztec turned the feeding of gods into a very complex sort of state ritual, just absolutely full of symbolism. In fact, one of the classic symbols of the Aztec Empire was three objects. One is the hummingbird, one is flowers, and the third is blood. And so what you would find is on any particular day, there would be large feeders put around. Hummingbirds were actually seen both as a god. In fact, this temple here is the hummingbird god's temple. And they were one of the predatory ones. Hummingbirds were actually seen as vampires. I'm not sure where they got this from, but Aztecs were firmly convinced that hummingbirds, all hummingbirds, little flying buzzing things, are basically gods, and they eat people. They might not eat you all at once, but they're carnivores, and they are all more powerful than people are. So they aren't just a bird; they're scary. And so one of the other aspects of this then was flowers, and in part this because hummingbirds, drink nectar from flowers. And so flowers were hugely important to the Aztec because I think in part, like the Asian counterpart, they saw flowers as being something very temporary. Flowers, bloomed and then they died. And the same way people grew and then died. And so flowers were a huge part of the Aztec world. In fact, flowers still are a huge part of the Azteca world in 21st century Mexico. And that's why, much more so than the United States, flowers are a hugely important symbol. But the other third symbol is blood. And what you don't see really in the image here, the Spanish are pretty adamant about this, they probably were accurate, is the Aztecs took the idea of feeding gods a step further. They made this a political state enterprise. And so the Aztec would send their armies around, throughout Mesoamerica and grab basically anyone they could and then bring them back here, take them up to the top of the pyramids when they were alive, lay them on an altar and rip their hearts out, and then give the hearts to the gods. So these ceremonies done here, you would take people, you take captives up here, take them up to the top of the altar. The priest would basically, rip them open, give the hearts to the gods to feed the hummingbird gods. And then the bodies would be just thrown down the steps. They just end up down here, and then people would collect them. The skulls would then be put on a rack here, and I can't remember where the other rack here. I think this is the big racks over here, I think. There was an attitude that generally this was an exaggeration of the Spanish, till I think it was in 2014 they were doing a subway extension in Mexico City, and they actually found the rack here. And it still had, I believe, over 1,000 skulls attached to it, and it obviously had all the posters. It could carry up to, I think, 10, 15,000 skulls on it, and you would replace them frequently. So the Aztecs, unlike prior Mesoamerican civilizations, which did some sacrifice, but much of the sacrifice was your own. In the Mayan and Tolteca world, you would go up the pyramid if you were somebody important, and you would, put thorns or something through your tongue, or jab yourself in the hand and drip your own blood to feed the gods. The Aztecs changed this. They did that too, but they added the idea of sacrifice. And at the time of the Spanish attack, when the Spanish tried to take over the capital, the Aztec, priesthood and elites went into a panic, and it's estimated they were executing up to 1,500, 2,000, 3,000 people a day, trying to feed the gods, to appease the gods, to get the to chase the Spanish away. So the Aztecs took this whole idea of people as prey and gods as predators, probably to its extreme. And not surprisingly, your Aztec homes were exactly like the Toltec and the other ones we saw at Teotihuacan, places people hid, because being out in here was only safe if the gods were fed. And so your perception of everything in the world around you, your place in the world, things like furniture, you're not going to have something like the Calvinist would, where you're going to make a home that's a statement that it's not part of the natural world, and it's going to be white, and it's going to be visible, and it's going to be gridded and structured. Nature doesn't do that. That's the last thing that you want in a world like this, unless you've got these, sort of protective devices around you, which are going to be the first points, almost like lightning rods, are going to be the first points of contact between the gods and their prey, which are people. So, it's just sort of a very short overview, but it gives you some idea of how different people see the world around them, how different people perceive the world around them, and how that totally changes the way that they build the world around them. And, not surprisingly, in a world like that, interior design is pretty much only within the concept of a refuge. Closest parallel I can think of would be a sort of like a bunker or something like that you would have. Hawaiians had refuge caves, for example, but those were only for very temporary, use. In the world of Mesoamerica, the gods were always around. The gods were always potentially hungry. The gods were always potentially on the look for people. And so you grew up and you lived and died in a world of not really fear, but sort of awareness that you were not important, and that the world was very much in the control of other things who really were not at all interested in anything you thought or had to say. Just about as far removed you can get from the Calvinists as possible. And not surprisingly, it's one reason why the Spanish just absolutely stomped on the Aztec belief system the minute that they saw it. It was so antithetical to everything that they stood for, as sort of 15th to 16th century Catholics.